Please forgive me, Mother. I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
For 32 years, Daniel Whitmore was ashamed to be seen next to his own mother. He avoided her at school pickups, walking 3 steps ahead so his classmates wouldn't ask who she was. He made her wait outside restaurants while he went in first to secure a table, always by the door, never in the middle of the room. At his own wedding, when a guest asked who the woman in the corner was, Daniel said she was an old family friend. Today, he is standing over her casket. His hands are folded, his face shows nothing. And the truth is, after 32 years of distance, he still does not know the real reason his mother's face looked the way it did. Everyone in that funeral home believes they are watching a grieving son, but grief requires understanding what you lost, and Daniel never once understood what he had. What he saw for 3 decades was a burned scar running from her temple to her collarbone, and he decided as a child that this was something to be embarrassed by. He never asked how it happened, not once. Not at 10 years old, not at 20, not even last year when she sat alone at Thanksgiving because he told his own children she couldn't make it. Ruth Whitmore never explained herself. She simply absorbed every silence he gave her, year after year, and said nothing in return. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happens next in Ruth Whitmore's story will change the way you see every person you've ever judged by their appearance. There is a photograph that exists, tucked away and rarely looked at, of Ruth as a young mother, unmarked, smiling, cradling an infant in a hospital blanket. In that photograph, her face is unscarred. Whatever happened to her happened after that photograph was taken, and whatever happened to her happened because of the infant she was holding. Daniel does not know this photograph exists. He has never asked to see pictures of his mother before he was born, because in his mind, the scar was simply always there, an inconvenient fact of his childhood rather than a chapter of a story he never bothered to read. What Daniel is about to discover, in the hours following his mother's funeral, is not simply the story of how her face was burned. It is the story of every dinner he skipped, every holiday he shortened, every introduction he shortened into a lie, replayed against a truth he was never given the chance to know because he never once thought to ask for it. Somewhere in this house, in a drawer Ruth kept locked for over 30 years, is an answer that will make him understand exactly what his mother gave up the moment she chose to save his life instead of her own face. This is the story of a woman who never asked her son for a single word of gratitude, even though gratitude was the one thing she had earned more than anyone else on earth. This is the story of the fire nobody talked about, the silence that outlived a marriage, and the letter that was never supposed to be read until it was far too late to say sorry to her face. Stay with us, because by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why Ruth Whitmore let her own son believe the worst about her for 32 years, and why she never said a single word to stop him. 3 people sit at the center of this story, and only one of them is still alive to feel what comes next. There is Ruth, the mother whose face became a mark of shame to the one person who should have defended her. There is Robert, her husband, a man who carried a secret of his own to his grave years before Ruth ever joined him there. And there is Daniel, the son, standing in a funeral home right now, about to walk into a house that will not let him leave the same man who walked into it. Here is what you need to know before we go back to where this all began. Somewhere in Ruth's past is a single night that decided the shape of the rest of her life. Somewhere in that night is the real reason for the scar Daniel spent 32 years being embarrassed by. Then somewhere in Ruth's house, locked in a drawer for over 3 decades, is a letter she wrote and never intended anyone to read until the day she was no longer around to watch them read it. Who was Ruth Whitmore before that night changed her face forever? What really happened inside that house? And why did she let her own son believe a lie about her for the rest of his childhood and most of his adult life? To understand the answer, we have to go back to the beginning, long before Daniel was ever born, to the version of Ruth nobody in this story remembers anymore. Ruth Whitmore was 24 years old when she married Robert, a quiet mechanic from a neighboring town, in a small church wedding attended by fewer than 40 people. Those who knew her back then describe a woman with an easy laugh and an even easier warmth, the kind of person who remembered birthdays without being reminded and brought soup to sick neighbors without being asked. She sang in the church choir on Sundays and kept a small garden behind the house she and Robert bought together, a modest 2-bedroom home on the edge of town. Friends from that time say Ruth talked about motherhood the way some people talk about a destination they have been waiting years to reach. When she became pregnant with Daniel, she kept a journal of every kick, every appointment, every small milestone, filling its pages with a kind of hope that, looking back, makes what happened next even harder to sit with. There was a small detail from that period that nobody thought much of at the time. The heater in the nursery, an older unit the previous homeowners had left behind, occasionally sparked when it kicked on. Robert had mentioned replacing it more than once. It was the kind of small, forgettable household task that gets pushed to next month, and then the month after that, the way so many small warnings do before they become something else entirely. Robert, for his part, carried a private guilt about that heater for the rest of his life, one he rarely spoke about but never fully set down. He was the one who had noticed the sparking months earlier. He was the one who had told himself, week after week, that it could wait until the next paycheck came in. Co-workers who knew him in later years describe a man who became almost obsessive about home maintenance, checking wiring and appliances in his own house with a kind of vigilance that seemed excessive for the small tasks involved, though none of them understood the reason until long after his death. Whatever guilt Robert carried, he never once let it become an excuse to break the promise he made to Ruth. If anything, those who knew him best believe it was that very guilt which made him so protective of Daniel's ignorance for the rest of his life. As though shielding his son from the truth might, in some small way, also shield him from having to explain his own role in how that night began. Daniel was born in early spring, and by all accounts, his first year of life was ordinary in every comforting way a new parent could hope for. Ruth adjusted her days around his naps. Robert worked long shifts to cover the cost of a growing family. There is nothing in the story of that first year that anyone could point to and say, this is where it started to go wrong, because nothing had gone wrong yet. That is what makes the night that follows so difficult to sit with. It did not arrive as the result of a mistake or a warning ignored. It arrived the way most life-altering nights do, quietly, inside an evening that looked exactly like every other evening before it. What we do know is that the woman Daniel grew up resenting was, before he was even old enough to form memories, a person who loved him with the kind of intensity most children never fully register until it is too late to thank the person who gave it to them. That love is the piece Daniel would spend the next 3 decades failing to see, buried underneath a scar he never once asked the origin of. A childhood friend of Daniel's, a boy named Peter who lived across the street until his family moved away when the two were around 11, remembers a specific afternoon that Daniel himself would later say he had completely forgotten. The two boys had been playing in Ruth's backyard when Peter, without any cruelty intended, asked Ruth directly what had happened to her face. Ruth knelt down to his eye level, smiled, and told him simply that she had been in an accident a long time ago, one that didn't hurt anymore, and that she was just glad he felt comfortable enough to ask. Peter recalls thinking nothing more of it. Daniel, standing a few feet away, said nothing that day, but according to Peter, he seemed almost embarrassed that his friend had asked the question at all, as though the question itself, rather than the scar, was the uncomfortable part. It was one of the earliest signs, small as it was, of a discomfort that would only grow heavier with time. By the time Daniel was old enough to understand what other children thought of his mother's face, he had already decided, without ever being told, that the scar was something wrong with her rather than something that had happened to her. Children at school pickup would stare, sometimes whisper, occasionally ask him directly what happened to his mom's face, and Daniel, not knowing the answer himself, learned to change the subject, or walk faster, or pretend he hadn't heard. Ruth noticed. She always noticed. But she never offered an explanation, not even when he was old enough to understand one. Those close to the family, including a longtime neighbor named Marie who lived 2 doors down for over 20 years, say Ruth made a conscious decision early on never to bring it up unless Daniel asked her directly. He never did. As Daniel grew into an adult, that childhood shame calcified into something colder. Marie recalls watching him, well into his 30s, ask his mother to wait outside a restaurant while he secured a table, or introduce her to new coworkers as a family friend rather than his mother. At his own son's birthday party, Marie says, Ruth was asked to sit in a folding chair near the garage rather than at the table with the rest of the family. An arrangement nobody discussed out loud but everyone quietly understood. Ruth attended anyway. She always attended. She brought a gift every single year, for every occasion, regardless of how she was seated or introduced or acknowledged. Marie remembers finding Ruth crying alone in her kitchen on more than one occasion, always in the same quiet, contained way, never asking for comfort, never wanting to be a burden even in her own grief. When Marie once asked her directly why she allowed Daniel to treat her this way without saying anything in her own defense, Ruth gave an answer Marie says she has never forgotten. He has a right to feel however he feels, Ruth told her. I made my peace with it a long time ago. What Marie did not understand at the time, and what she would only come to understand years later, was that Ruth's peace was not resignation. It was a promise she had made to herself the night of the fire, one she intended to keep for the rest of her life, no matter what it cost her. There was one detail Marie noticed but never asked about, not until many years later. In the back corner of Ruth's bedroom sat an old wooden dresser, and inside its bottom drawer was a lock Ruth had installed herself, years before Marie ever met her. Marie asked about it exactly once, early in their friendship. Ruth's answer was short. "There's something in there," she said, "something I'll explain when the time is right." The time, as it turned out, would not come until Ruth herself was no longer alive to explain it in person. There is something else worth understanding about Ruth during these years, something that makes her silence even harder to reconcile. She was not a woman who avoided conflict out of weakness. Co-workers from the small accounting office where she worked for over 2 decades describe her as direct, occasionally blunt, someone who would correct a mistake on a client's file without hesitation and never shied away from an uncomfortable conversation when the situation called for one. This was not a woman incapable of defending herself. She simply made a decision, deliberately and repeatedly, not to defend herself against her own son, for reasons that would not become clear until decades later. It is worth asking, at this point in the story, what kind of restraint that actually required. Imagine watching your own child grow increasingly distant, increasingly embarrassed, increasingly unwilling to be seen beside you, and choosing every single time to say nothing rather than offer the one explanation that would have changed everything instantly. Ruth had that explanation available to her for 32 years. One sentence could have ended Daniel's shame the moment he was old enough to understand it. She never spoke that sentence. The question this story keeps circling back to, the one we will not fully answer until much later, is why a woman capable of ending her own suffering in an instant chose instead to carry it in silence for over 3 decades. To understand the night that changed everything, we have to return to a house that, on the surface, looked like every other house on that street. Daniel was not yet a year old. Robert was working a night shift at the auto shop where he had been employed for nearly 6 years, the kind of steady, unremarkable job that pays the bills without ever making headlines. Ruth was home alone with the baby, finishing the last of the evening's chores before putting him down for the night. Neighbors who lived nearby at the time described that evening as unremarkable in every way, the kind of ordinary night that fades from memory within a week, if not for what happened next. The nursery sat at the end of a narrow hallway, its walls painted a pale yellow Ruth had chosen herself during her pregnancy. She had checked on Daniel twice already that evening, adjusting his blanket, making sure the small nightlight near his crib was working. The old heater, the one Robert had meant to replace, had been running steadily for most of the evening, its occasional spark a background detail nobody in that house had learned to fear. Sometime after midnight, that spark caught something it should never have reached, and within minutes, smoke began filling the nursery faster than any smoke detector installed in a home from that era could reasonably keep up with. Ruth was in the kitchen when the smell reached her, faint at first, then unmistakable. What happened over the next several minutes would go on to define the rest of her life, and the rest of Daniel's, though he would not understand any of it for over 3 decades. She ran. Neighbors who were awake that night recall hearing her before they saw anything, a sound one described only as unlike anything she had heard a human being make before or since. By the time Ruth reached the nursery, the doorway itself was already lit with flame, the curtains near the crib fully engulfed. There was no time to consider an alternative route, no time to wait for help that was still minutes away. Ruth went through the doorway anyway, using her own body to shield Daniel as she pulled him from the crib, turning her face and shoulder toward the flames as a support beam near the window gave way behind her. One of the first responders on the scene that night, a firefighter who had been with the department for over a decade by that point, would later tell Robert something he never forgot and eventually repeated to Ruth herself, once she was well enough to hear it. He said that in all his years on the job, he had rarely seen a parent reach a child as fast as Ruth had reached Daniel that night, and that the position she was found in when help finally arrived, curled protectively around her son with her back and shoulder absorbing the worst of the heat, was not something anyone had needed to teach her. It was instinct, pure and immediate, the kind that exists in a person before conscious thought even has time to catch up to it. She got him out. That part of the story, Daniel would eventually learn, was never in question. What he did not know, for 32 years, was what it cost her to do it. The right side of her face, from her temple down through her neck and collarbone, along with a portion of her right arm, sustained burns severe enough that doctors at the hospital that night were uncertain, in the earliest hours, whether she would survive the injury at all. Robert arrived at the hospital still in his work uniform, having been called away from his shift, to find his wife bandaged beyond recognition and his infant son, remarkably, without a single burn on his body. Ruth would later tell Robert, once she was lucid enough to speak, that she remembered very little of the fire itself beyond the sound of Daniel crying and the certainty that she needed to reach him before anything else in that house mattered. She did not ask about her own condition until nearly a full day after the incident. When she finally did ask, and a doctor gently explained that the scarring would likely be permanent, Ruth's only recorded response, according to hospital staff who treated her that week, was to ask once more whether her son was safe, and to say nothing else about her face for the remainder of her hospital stay. It was during that same hospital stay that Ruth made the decision that would quietly shape the next 3 decades of her life. She told Robert, in a conversation he would only ever describe to a handful of people, that she did not want Daniel to grow up knowing the true circumstances of her scars. She did not want him carrying the weight of guilt for something that had happened to him as a helpless infant, something he could not have prevented or understood. Robert argued against it at first, believing their son deserved the truth no matter his age. Ruth was unmovable. "He was a baby," she told him. "He didn't do this to me. I won't let him spend his whole life believing he did." What Ruth could not have predicted, sitting in that hospital bed with her face wrapped in bandages, was that her silence would eventually be misread not as sacrifice, but as something shameful to hide from. She believed she was protecting her son from an unbearable weight. She had no way of knowing that the absence of an explanation would, over time, become its own kind of wound, one that would follow both of them for the rest of her life. There is a detail from that hospital stay that Robert only shared with one person in his lifetime, a co-worker he had known for years, who in turn shared it with Marie long after Robert had passed away. In the earliest hours after the fire, before doctors could confirm that Ruth would survive her injuries, a nurse asked Robert whether there was anything he wanted to say to his wife, in case there was not another opportunity. Robert sat beside her bed and told her, through the bandages covering most of her face, that she was still, and would always be, the most beautiful woman he had ever known. Ruth, barely conscious, managed only a single response before drifting under sedation again. "Tell him that too," she said, "someday." Robert promised her he would. It was a promise, like so many others in this family, that would take far longer to keep than anyone intended. The recovery that followed was slow and, by every account available, physically painful in ways that extended well beyond the visible scarring. Ruth underwent multiple procedures over the following 2 years, each one bringing its own recovery period, each one a reminder of a night she rarely spoke about even to Robert. Through all of it, those who visited her during recovery say she asked about Daniel constantly, wanting updates on every small development, every new sound he had learned to make, every inch he had grown, as though tracking his progress was the only medicine that mattered to her. Robert kept his promise to Ruth for the rest of his life. He never told Daniel the truth about the fire, even as his son grew older and the questions, when they came at all, were asked with less curiosity and more discomfort. Robert died when Daniel was 17, a sudden heart complication that gave the family no time to prepare and left Ruth to raise a teenager alone while grieving a husband of nearly 2 decades. With Robert's death, the only other person who knew the real story of that night was gone, and Ruth, true to the promise she had made in that hospital room years earlier, still said nothing. It was during Daniel's teenage years that Marie, the neighbor, first began noticing the shift in how he treated his mother. What had once looked like a child's simple embarrassment began hardening into something closer to resentment. Daniel stopped inviting friends over to the house. He asked Ruth more than once not to attend school events, claiming he didn't want the distraction, though Marie suspected the real reason went unspoken between them. Ruth attended fewer events after that, not because she agreed with his reasoning, but because she had grown tired, Marie believes, of watching him flinch every time she walked into a room. There was one afternoon, when Daniel was around 19, that Marie says nearly broke the pattern entirely. Ruth had come home from a doctor's appointment unrelated to the fire, visibly shaken, and Daniel, home from college for the weekend, had asked what was wrong more out of routine than genuine concern. For a brief moment, sitting at the kitchen table, Ruth looked as though she might finally tell him everything, the fire, the choice she made, all of it. Marie, who happened to be visiting that day, remembers watching Ruth's expression change, watching her open her mouth to speak, and then watching her close it again, choosing instead to say she was simply tired and needed to rest. Marie asked her afterward why she hadn't said anything. Ruth's answer was quiet. "He's not ready to hear it without blaming himself," she said, "and I won't do that to him, not yet." That moment, more than any other, convinced Marie that Ruth's silence was not simply avoidance. It was a decision she revisited constantly and chose to maintain every single time. The pattern only deepened once Daniel became an adult. He married in his late 20s, and at his wedding, when a distant relative asked a bridesmaid who the woman near the back of the venue was, Daniel, standing close enough to hear the question, answered before anyone else could. "She's an old family friend," he said, loud enough for Ruth to hear from several feet away. Marie, who attended the wedding as Ruth's guest, remembers walking Ruth to the car afterward and asking if she wanted to talk about what had just happened. Ruth said only that she was tired, and that Daniel had a lot on his plate that day. Daniel's wife, Sarah, was not fully aware of the pattern in the earliest years of their marriage, largely because Daniel rarely spoke about his mother at all, and the two saw Ruth infrequently enough that Sarah had little to compare it against. It was only after several years, once their own children were born, that Sarah began to notice how carefully Daniel managed every interaction involving his mother. Always brief, always slightly rehearsed, always positioned to minimize how much time the children spent alone with her. Sarah asked him about it once, gently, during a quiet moment after one of Ruth's short visits. Daniel's answer was vague, something about not wanting to overwhelm the kids with too many relatives at once, an explanation Sarah accepted at the time without fully believing it. She would later tell Marie, after everything came to light, that some part of her had always sensed there was a story underneath Daniel's discomfort that neither of them fully understood, though she never could have guessed how large that story actually was. In the weeks after the fire, the incident made a brief appearance in the local paper. A short article buried several pages in, noting the address, the extent of the damage, and a single line confirming that both occupants had survived. There was no follow-up story, no interview with the family, nothing beyond that single paragraph most readers likely skimmed past without a second thought. For Ruth and Robert, that anonymity was, in its own way, a small mercy. It meant the story of that night existed almost nowhere outside their own household, easy enough to keep contained once they made the decision to contain it. Had that article received more attention, had a reporter ever knocked on their door asking follow-up questions, Ruth and Robert's plan to shield Daniel from the truth might never have survived his childhood at all. Instead, the story faded from public memory within days, leaving only the people inside that house to carry what had happened, in whatever way each of them chose to carry it. The years that followed brought more of the same, each incident small enough on its own to be forgivable, but accumulating into something far heavier when considered together. There was also, during these years, a recurring detail that Marie says has stayed with her more than almost any other. Every time Ruth left one of these gatherings early, or was seated apart from the rest of the family, or was introduced with a vague and distancing label instead of the word mother, she would return home, change out of whatever she had worn for the occasion, and continue her evening exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. She never called anyone to vent. She rarely mentioned it even to Marie unless Marie asked directly. The only outward sign that anything had affected her at all was a habit she developed of sitting on her back porch a little longer than usual on those particular evenings, watching the same yard she had once gardened in as a young mother, saying nothing to anyone. Ruth was asked to sit apart from the family in photographs. She was left off invitations to smaller, more intimate gatherings, told each time that the guest list simply couldn't be expanded. One particular Thanksgiving, when Daniel was in his early 30s, stands out clearly in Marie's memory, largely because Ruth mentioned it to her more than once in the years that followed. Ruth had spent nearly 2 full days preparing food for the gathering, including a pie Daniel had loved since childhood, one she still made from memory every year without needing the recipe in front of her. When she arrived, Daniel met her at the door and explained, quickly and without much warmth, that his in-laws would also be attending that year, and that it might be easier, given how many people were already expected, if Ruth joined them for a shorter visit earlier in the day rather than staying for the full dinner. Ruth agreed, as she always did, dropped off the pie, spent perhaps 40 minutes in the house exchanging pleasantries, and left before the rest of the guests arrived. Marie says Ruth called her that same evening, not to complain, but simply to talk, filling the silence of her own empty dining room with conversation about anything other than the holiday she had just quietly been excluded from. She never once brought it up to Daniel directly. The following year, she made the same pie again. When Daniel's children were born, Marie recalls a conversation she overheard, one Ruth was not meant to hear but did anyway, in which Daniel told his wife he didn't want their kids asking questions about their grandmother's face, and that it would be easier for everyone if visits stayed infrequent and brief. Ruth heard the entire conversation from the next room. She said nothing that day either. She sent a birthday card to her grandchildren 2 weeks later, as she always did, with a small check tucked inside, and a note signed only, "Love, Grandma Ruth." In the final years of her life, Ruth was diagnosed with a terminal illness that she chose, deliberately, not to disclose to her son. Marie was the only person she told, and only because Marie happened to be present the day Ruth received the diagnosis and drove her home from the appointment. Ruth made Marie promise not to contact Daniel until, in her words, it was almost over. When Marie pushed back, arguing that Daniel deserved the chance to be present for his mother's final months regardless of how he had treated her, Ruth's response was calm and final. "He has his own life," she said. "I won't be a burden to him even now." Marie kept that promise for as long as she could bear to. In the final weeks, she did eventually call Daniel, informing him only that his mother was unwell and that he might want to visit when he had time. The call Daniel made back to his mother that week would turn out to be their last conversation. Ruth, weakened but still hoping to hear his voice a while longer, tried to keep him on the line. Daniel, distracted by his own responsibilities and unaware of how little time remained, told her he didn't have long to talk and would call again soon. Ruth's only response, according to Marie, who was in the room at the time, was a soft and unbothered, "I understand, sweetheart. Take care of yourself." She died 12 days later. Daniel never called again in time. In the days between that final phone call and the one that would inform him of her death, Ruth continued a habit Marie had witnessed for years without ever fully understanding its purpose. Each evening, weak as she had become, Ruth asked Marie to help her write a short note, one line each night, in a small notebook she kept beside her bed. Marie assumed, at the time, that these were simply reflections, a woman putting her thoughts down as her illness progressed. It was not until after Ruth's death, when Marie finally read the notebook in full, that she understood what it actually was. Every single entry was addressed directly to Daniel. Every entry ended the same way, with some version of the same sentiment. "I hope you're well tonight, and I hope someday you'll understand." Ruth was still writing to a son who did not know he was being written to, until the very last night of her life. At the funeral, Daniel stood exactly where we found him at the beginning of this story, stone-faced, composed, unaware of how much of his composure was about to be undone. It was Marie who suggested, gently, that he go through his mother's belongings in the days following the service, and it was Marie who, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the locked drawer in Ruth's bedroom, the one she had asked about decades earlier and never received a full answer to. Daniel found the drawer exactly where Marie described it. The lock, old and slightly rusted, gave way easily enough with a screwdriver from his father's old toolbox, still kept in the garage after all these years. Inside, he found a stack of yellowed hospital documents, a small burned baby blanket folded carefully in tissue paper, an old newspaper clipping he did not yet have the context to understand, and, resting on top of everything else, a sealed envelope with his name written across the front in his mother's handwriting. Beneath his name, in smaller letters, were 5 additional words that stopped him completely. "For when you're ready." Daniel sat on the floor of his mother's bedroom for nearly 20 minutes before he opened it. He would later admit, to Marie and to no one else, that some part of him already suspected the envelope held something he wasn't prepared for, and that this suspicion was the only reason he hesitated at all. When he finally broke the seal, the letter inside was several pages long, written in the same careful handwriting as the label on the drawer, dated nearly 15 years earlier, long before Ruth's diagnosis, long before either of them could have known how much more time they would waste before this moment finally arrived. The letter began simply, "My dearest Daniel, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here to explain it to you myself, and I owe you an explanation I should have given you a long time ago." What followed was the story we have just told you, written in Ruth's own words: the fire, the nursery, the moment she chose to run toward the flames rather than wait for help that would have arrived too late. She described, in careful and unflinching detail, exactly what those minutes had cost her, and exactly why she and Robert had agreed never to tell him the truth while he was young enough for the guilt to shape him. But it was the final paragraph of that letter that Daniel would later say broke something open in him that 32 years of distance had never managed to touch. "My face was never a burden to me, Daniel," Ruth had written. "It was proof that you were worth saving, and I would make the same choice again in less time than it takes to read this sentence. I only ever wished you could have loved me without needing a reason first. I forgive you for not asking. I only wish I had found a way to make it easier for you to ask." Daniel called Marie within the hour, unable to process what he had just read alone in an empty house. Marie, who had waited decades to finally share what she knew, confirmed every detail the letter described, and produced something Daniel did not know existed: an old newspaper clipping from a local paper, reporting on a house fire on the very street Ruth and Robert had once lived on, dated to within days of Daniel's own infancy. Beside the article was a small, grainy photograph of firefighters outside a house Daniel did not immediately recognize, though the address printed beneath it matched hospital records he now held in his other hand. Daniel, still not entirely willing to accept the full weight of what he was holding, made one additional call that same week, tracking down the hospital where the records originated and requesting to speak with anyone who might still remember the case, unlikely as that seemed after so many decades. Remarkably, one nurse from that unit, now retired, still lived in the area and agreed to speak with him by phone. She did not remember every patient from that period of her career, she told him, but she remembered Ruth, specifically because of how insistently she had asked about her son's condition before ever asking about her own. That detail, relayed secondhand from a stranger who had no reason to embellish it, was, according to Marie, the moment Daniel finally stopped searching for a version of the story that might soften what he now understood to be true. The hospital documents, faded but still legible, listed Ruth's admission for 2nd and 3rd degree burns, along with a handwritten note from the attending physician describing an infant, unharmed, brought in alongside her. There was no ambiguity left in the story. Every detail Daniel had spent his life avoiding, every unasked question, every convenient assumption, collapsed at once into a single, unbearable fact. His mother had nearly died saving his life, and had spent the following 3 decades allowing him to believe whatever he needed to believe, rather than ask him to carry a truth she felt was never his to carry. It was Marie, in that same conversation, who finally handed Daniel the small bedside notebook Ruth had filled during her final weeks, the one containing a single line written to him every night, though he had never known it existed until this moment. Daniel read every entry that evening, sitting in the same chair his mother had once occupied at that kitchen table. Some entries were simple, mentioning the weather, or a song that had come on the radio that reminded her of him as a boy. Others were harder to read, entries where Ruth admitted, in her own private handwriting, how much she missed hearing his voice, and how she hoped, whenever the time finally came, that he would forgive himself once he understood the whole story, rather than carry a different kind of guilt in its place. That final wish, Marie says, was the one detail from that night that stayed with Daniel the longest. What followed, in the hours after that phone call, was something Marie would later describe as watching 32 years of memory rearrange itself in real time. Every skipped dinner, every excuse, every folding chair near the garage, every quiet birthday card sent to grandchildren who barely knew her, replayed itself in Daniel's mind with an entirely different meaning attached. He had spent a lifetime ashamed of a woman who had given him that lifetime in the first place, at a cost he never once thought to ask about. There was one more thing waiting for Daniel in that drawer, tucked beneath the letter in the hospital records, and it was this final discovery that Marie says truly broke him. Underneath everything else sat a worn savings passbook, decades old, showing regular deposits made over more than 15 years into an account Daniel did not recognize. When he traced the account number through his bank's records the following week, he learned it had been quietly funding a college trust for his own children, money Ruth had set aside from a modest fixed income, without ever once mentioning it, without ever asking for credit or acknowledgement of any kind. Beside the passbook was a second item Daniel almost overlooked entirely, a small cloth-bound scrapbook, its pages filled with every card, drawing and photograph he had ever given her, going back to a crayon drawing from kindergarten he did not even remember making. Birthday cards he had signed half-heartedly in his 20s sat beside handwritten notes Ruth had added beneath each one. Small observations about how he was doing that year, what he had been struggling with, what she had hoped for him. She had kept every fragment of affection he had ever offered her, however small, however infrequent, and treated each one as though it were something precious rather than something owed. Near the back of the scrapbook, Daniel found a page that stopped him longer than any other. It held a photograph he did not remember being taken, of himself at perhaps 6 years old, sitting on Ruth's lap on the same porch steps where she used to garden, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Beneath the photograph, in handwriting clearly added many years later, Ruth had written a single line: "This was the year he stopped noticing my face and started noticing me. I hope that boy comes back one day." When Daniel later asked Marie whether Ruth had ever expected him to find any of this, Marie told him she didn't believe Ruth expected anything at all. She simply kept preparing for the possibility, patiently, for over 3 decades, in case the day ever came. It would be simple to end this story here, with Daniel's transformation, and call it a resolution. But those closest to the family say the truth is more complicated than a single turning point at a graveside. Daniel has told Marie more than once that understanding his mother's sacrifice did not erase the years he spent failing to see it, and that no amount of love shown now can retroactively reach a woman who is no longer alive to receive it. What he has instead, he says, is the responsibility of making sure her story is never repeated in his own family, of making sure his children grow up asking questions rather than making assumptions, of making sure that love in his house is never conditional on how someone looks or how easily their story can be explained. It is not the ending he would have chosen, given the chance to choose. It is, however, the only ending available to him now, and he has decided to make something worthwhile out of it. There is a difficult truth sitting at the center of this story, one that extends well beyond Ruth and Daniel Whitmore. We like to believe we would recognize sacrifice when we see it, that we would know a person who has given up something enormous for our sake simply by looking at them. But sacrifice does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly on someone's face for 32 years, waiting patiently to be asked about, never once demanding the recognition it deserves. Ruth Whitmore carried the physical evidence of what she gave up every single day of her adult life, in full view of the one person who most needed to understand it. Daniel carried the shame of never having asked. Only one of them, in the end, ever managed to say the word sorry, and by the time he did, the person who most needed to hear it was no longer there to receive it. That is the question this story leaves behind, long after the letter has been folded and put away. Would you have recognized her sacrifice sooner than he did? Or would you too have believed exactly what your eyes told you and never once thought to ask what they weren't showing you? If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us while telling it, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what is one thing you would say to your own mother today if you had the chance to say it right now, without hesitation, without waiting for the right moment? So many of us carry small, unspoken things we assume we'll have time to say eventually. Ruth Whitmore's story is a reminder that eventually is not a guarantee anyone is given. Comment the words "I see her" if this story changed the way you think about your own mother, your own grandmother, or anyone in your life whose sacrifices you may have overlooked simply because they never asked to be noticed. We read every single comment, and we would love to know where in the world you're watching this from tonight. If Ruth and Daniel's story moved you, wait until you hear the story we're bringing you next, about a father who staged his own disappearance to protect the family he was convinced he was failing, and the daughter who spent 20 years believing he had simply walked away. That story asks a very different question, but it will leave you with the same ache this one did. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed and that your notifications are turned on, because we bring you real human stories like this one every single week. Stories about the people we think we understand completely, until we finally learn the one detail that changes everything. Thank you for staying with us through Ruth Whitmore's story from beginning to end. She never asked to be understood. We hope, in some small way, tonight she finally was. Stories like this one remind us that the people who love us most rarely announce the full weight of what they carry. They simply keep showing up, year after year, holiday after holiday, asking for nothing in return, trusting that someday, somehow, we will finally take the time to ask. If you know someone in your own life who has quietly given more than you ever fully acknowledged, consider this your reminder tonight. Call them. Ask them the question you've never asked. You may not be given a locked drawer and a letter to find the answer for you. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of the people who took care of you first. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know what part of Ruth's story hit you the hardest. See you in the next video.